On a cold morning in January 1840, as Queen Victoria prepared for her upcoming marriage to Prince Albert, newspapers across London celebrated what they called the ideal union. But behind the polished photographs, engraved portraits, and romantic poems of the era, something far darker defined the reality for millions of ordinary Victorian husbands and wives. Victorian marriage was not simply a personal commitment. It was a binding legal cage. It dictated a woman's body, her money, her labor, her identity, and even her children. And for countless couples trapped inside its rigid expectations, the institution was far more suffocating than most modern people imagine. To understand why, we must step into a world where marriage wasn't built on compatibility or affection, but on ownership, duty, and social survival. England in the mid-19th century was experiencing massive transformation. Factories roared through the day, cities like Manchester and London swelled with new populations, and the middle class grew more visible than ever before in British society. Yet despite these sweeping changes, marriage laws remained rooted in ideas centuries old. By law, a married woman's identity was swallowed entirely by her husband's the moment the ceremony ended. This was the doctrine of coverture, written into British common law centuries earlier but still brutally enforced in the Victorian age. A wife could not own property. She could not open a bank account. She could not sue or be sued. She had no legal existence separate from her husband. Her wages, if she worked, belonged entirely to him. Her children legally belonged to him as well. And if a marriage turned abusive or destructive, the law offered her almost no escape. For most working-class families, marriage began as a practical transaction rather than a romantic choice. Working-class men needed a wife not for companionship, but for survival, someone to cook, clean, raise children, take in laundry, and maintain the home while he worked long hours in mines or factories. Victorian society romanticized motherhood, yet it also expected women to give birth repeatedly under brutal physical conditions. Many women spent their entire adult lives either pregnant, breastfeeding, or recovering from pregnancy. Meanwhile, wealthy women faced a different but equally restrictive fate. In the upper classes, marriage was a business contract, families trading daughters to consolidate wealth, land, or status. A young woman from a wealthy household could spend years learning music, French, embroidery, and etiquette, only to be married off at 16 or 17 to a man twice her age who needed an heir. Victorian culture celebrated the image of the angel in the house, a woman who was obedient, soft-spoken, morally pure, and endlessly patient. In reality, this ideal suffocated countless women behind velvet curtains and gilded dining room walls. For middle-class wives, the pressure was perhaps the worst of all. This new social group prided itself on morality, respectability, and family stability. Men worked in offices and professions, while wives were expected to rule the home with military precision. They were responsible for raising perfectly behaved children, managing servants, supervising the household budget without ever having real financial power, and maintaining an image of flawless domestic order. Any failure reflected shame on the husband. Middle-class marriage became a performance, one that exhausted women physically and emotionally. Even courtship was trapped in rigid expectations. Under Victorian rules, women were not allowed to show desire, interest, or initiative. A woman who seemed eager risked being labeled unrespectable. The ideal Victorian wife was supposed to be innocent, passive, and ignorant of anything sexual. Some marriage manuals even suggested women should endure intimacy silently, without emotion, because expressing pleasure would make them animalistic or unladylike. Men, on the other hand, were not only allowed but culturally encouraged to visit prostitutes before marriage. This created a dangerous imbalance. Many women contracted diseases from their husbands on their wedding night, with no power to refuse intimacy and no legal right to protest. Marriage also served as a tool of discipline. A woman who resisted marriage or failed to secure a husband by her mid 20s could face social ridicule. Newspapers, novels, and etiquette guides constantly warned women that unmarried life meant poverty, gossip, and loneliness. Victorian England made it clear marriage was not just encouraged, it was a requirement for a respectable life. Yet within the walls of these homes were countless stories of quiet suffering, abuse, neglect, manipulation, and despair. Because divorce was nearly impossible, before the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857, the only legal path to divorce required a private act of Parliament and was so expensive only the wealthiest men could pursue it. Even after 1857, the law remained heavily biased. A husband could divorce a wife solely for adultery, but a wife had to prove adultery plus cruelty, desertion, bigamy, or incest. Many women remained trapped for life. In this suffocating environment, scandals exploded like shockwaves. Newspapers printed sensational stories of runaway wives, secret affairs, violent husbands, and court cases that exposed the ugly underbelly of Victorian domestic life. One of the most infamous cases was that of Caroline Norton, a brilliant writer whose husband beat her, stole her earnings, and denied her access to her children. Her struggle eventually helped reshape British law, but only after years of public humiliation and suffering. The Victorian home may appear elegant in paintings, with polished brass, heavy drapes, and quiet parlours, but behind that facade, marriages were often defined by fear, control, and silence. Whether you were a working-class woman scrubbing laundry for endless hours, a middle-class wife trapped by impossible expectations, or an aristocratic woman married for political advantage, marriage shaped your identity and often destroyed it. Victorian marriage wasn't simply a personal arrangement. It was a system, a deeply restrictive, carefully engineered institution designed to protect male power, preserve social order, and enforce rigid gender roles. And the consequences of this system would impact generations, influencing marriage laws, women's rights, and social attitudes well into the 20th century. This is where the story begins, in a world that looked polished from the outside, but hid a darkness that shaped the lives of millions. A world where love was optional, but obedience was mandatory. A world where women had to navigate marriage not as a partnership, but as a survival strategy. And as we move deeper into the heart of Victorian life, the truth becomes even more disturbing. By the early 1850s, the ideal of Victorian marriage had solidified into a rigid social script. While newspapers displayed smiling brides and proud grooms, behind the doors of Britain's terraced houses, soot, darkened apartments, and sprawling country estates, the daily reality of marriage was far more suffocating. To understand how truly restrictive this life was, we must step inside the Victorian household and witness how every room, every expectation, and every law shaped the life of a married woman. Victorian homes were considered the center of moral life, the place where the family's honor was preserved. Yet for women, they often became elaborate prisons. From morning until night, a wife's life revolved around the endless cycle of domestic labor, childcare, social obligations, and emotional suppression. Society praised mothers as sacred figures, but ignored the crushing weight placed on their shoulders. Whether wealthy or poor, no Victorian wife escaped the demands of the home. A working-class wife's day began before sunrise. She prepared the fire, fetched water, cooked breakfast, washed linens, scrubbed floors, and managed children, often while pregnant. Victorian families were large. 6 to 10 children were common, and pregnancy was nearly constant. A wife might bury more children than she raised. Infant mortality rates were brutal, and every pregnancy carried deadly risks. Childbirth was a battlefield with no antibiotics, poor hygiene, and limited medical knowledge. Many women died in their 20s and early 30s from complications like infection or exhaustion. A working-class husband, returning from long factory shifts, often brought home wages that belonged entirely to him. If he drank them away, the family starved. If he became violent, the wife had no legal protection. Police rarely intervened in domestic matters, and the law largely viewed wives as their husband's property. Drunkenness, harsh words, and physical punishment were tolerated as unfortunate but normal features of marriage. Middle-class women faced a different kind of suffering. They had servant help, nicer homes, and less physical labor, but the emotional demands were crushing. Victorian culture insisted that a respectable woman should be gentle, calm, and free from any sinful impulses. She was expected to present a perfect image to her community: a peaceful home, obedient children, and a patient, smiling demeanor. Any sign of frustration or ambition was condemned as unfeminine. Her marriage became a performance, and she its lead actor. She supervised servants, managed household accounts, planned meals, taught children, visited friends for carefully arranged afternoon teas, and attended church regularly, all while maintaining purity and modesty. She was expected to be grateful, humble, and constantly aware that her reputation was the backbone of her husband's social standing. A single rumor could destroy a family's place in society. Upper-class women endured marriages shaped by political alliances and family strategy. Many married men they barely knew. Husbands traveled frequently, often leaving their wives isolated in vast country estates with only servants for company. Affairs were common, particularly among men, and wives were expected to ignore them. Victorian society viewed male infidelity as regrettable but natural, while female infidelity was a sin that could lead to social ruin or legal punishment. This double standard extended into intimacy. Victorian advice manuals told wives to endure marital relations without enthusiasm. Women were expected to be sexually passive, sometimes even ignorant of intimacy until the wedding night. Men, meanwhile, were encouraged to visit prostitutes or gain experience before marriage. This created a dangerous pattern. Countless Victorian wives contracted diseases like syphilis from their husbands, yet had no legal right to refuse intimacy. Some went blind, became infertile, or died as a result. Inside the Victorian home, silence became a survival tactic. A wife rarely voiced dissatisfaction. She kept her struggles hidden behind lace curtains and polished mahogany tables. To speak out was to risk social humiliation. To complain was to seem ungrateful, and to rebel was to threaten the delicate order that society believed held civilization itself together. Children were raised in this atmosphere of quiet tension. Boys watched their fathers dominate. Girls watched their mothers obey. The cycle repeated across generations. Victorian marriage taught children that men were rulers and women were supporters, shaping how they behaved as adults. Yet beneath the surface, rebellion was growing. Over time, women began to challenge the rules that governed their lives. Writers, activists, and ordinary wives pushed back against the oppressive laws that trapped them. One of the most significant voices was Caroline Norton, whose husband denied her access to her children and stole her earnings. Her public fight exposed the cruelty of Britain's legal system and eventually contributed to the Custody of Infants Act of 1839 and later the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857. But even after these reforms, Victorian wives remained constrained. Divorce was still extremely difficult, costly, and biased toward men. Courts judged women harshly and often publicly. Newspapers published scandalous details, turning divorcing wives into social pariahs. Many women stayed married simply because divorce meant poverty, disgrace, or losing their children forever. As feminism slowly emerged in the late 19th century, more women began questioning their roles. Groups like the Langham Place Circle pushed for education, employment, and property rights for women. The Married Women's Property Act of 1870 and its later expansion in 1882 finally allowed married women to own money and property. These laws marked the beginning of the end for coverture. but did not erase the emotional and social constraints that had defined Victorian marriage for decades. Inside the home, however, little changed immediately. Social expectations remained strict. The angel in the house of ideal, the fantasy of the perfect, self-sacrificing wife, continued to dominate literature, art, and culture. Women were praised for suffering in silence, and men were praised for being providers, even if they were neglectful or abusive. This culture created marriages that were not partnerships, but hierarchies. Many husbands ruled their households with unquestioned authority. They controlled money, travel, education, and decisions about children. Wives had little influence outside the home and were discouraged from seeking fulfillment beyond family duties. Even writing, painting, or pursuing hobbies could be seen as distractions from their responsibilities. Victorian homes were often beautifully decorated, yet beneath their elegance were layers of emotional tension. A polished dining table might hide the silence of a wife afraid to speak. A well-kept nursery might hide the grief of lost children. A fine carriage might hide a woman trapped in a loveless marriage she could never escape. In the end, Victorian marriage was built not on love or equality, but on tradition, control, and societal expectation. It shaped every moment of a woman's life, from the way she dressed to the way she spoke, from the number of children she bore to the future she could never freely choose. It is only when we step inside these homes, hear the silence, and see the burden carried in the shadows that we begin to truly understand why Victorian marriage was far worse than many imagine, and how its legacy still echoes today. By the 1860s, the Victorian marriage system had hardened into something resembling a national ideology, celebrated in poems, defended in sermons, and enforced through law. Beneath the polite conversation of drawing rooms and the rigid etiquette of dinner parties, countless women endured marriages defined by emotional suffocation, financial dependence, and at times brutal abuse. And because Victorian England wrapped these marriages in the language of morality and duty, suffering wives often faced not sympathy, but condemnation if they dared to speak out. To understand how deeply marriage controlled a woman's life, it is necessary to explore the legal machinery that reinforced it. At the core was coverture, the ancient doctrine that erased a woman's identity when she married. Legally, she became one with her husband, and that one was always him. Everything she owned, earned, or produced became his property. She had no claim to her wages. Even her clothing legally belonged to her husband. This meant that if a woman fled an abusive marriage, she could be arrested for stealing the dress she wore on her own body. Under coverture, husbands were not only expected to discipline their wives, they were socially encouraged to do so. Victorian society treated a wife as a moral project. If she was disobedient, emotional, or outspoken, it reflected poorly on her husband. Many men interpreted this expectation as justification for physical punishment. Courts rarely intervened unless the violence was extreme enough to cause permanent injury. Even then, judges often urged wives to return home and behave dutifully. The law did little to protect women from sexual violence within marriage. Victorian marriage manuals insisted that a wife's primary duty was submission. Clergymen preached that a wife must always be available to her husband, and because the law considered marital intimacy a husband's right, wives could not refuse without risking accusations of disobedience or insanity. It wasn't until more than a century later that marital sexual violence became widely recognized as a crime. This system created conditions where abuse thrived. Newspapers regularly reported cases of women who had been beaten, starved, or locked in rooms. But in most instances, the public viewed these tragedies not as failures of law, but as sensational scandals. A particularly infamous case was that of Isabella Banks, whose husband repeatedly beat her. When she attempted to leave him, he dragged her back by force because the law allowed him to reclaim his property. Similar cases filled courtrooms, yet judges often faulted wives for provoking their husbands. Middle-class women suffered from a different form of abuse, psychological imprisonment. Victorian husbands controlled their wives' reading, correspondence, friendships, and movements. A wife who expressed independent thought risked being labeled unstable. In fact, the Victorian era saw a disturbing increase in the number of women confined to asylums, often at the request of their husbands. Doctors believed women suffered from hysteria, a vague diagnosis that could be applied to almost any behavior, from sadness to anger, from ambition to sexual desire. Once committed, a woman lost nearly all hope of release. Some asylums required only a husband's signature for admission and no legal counterbalance from the wife. A minor disagreement, a perceived insult, or even fatigue could be enough for a husband to declare his wife mentally unfit. Many women spent years behind asylum walls, surrounded not by truly ill patients, but by wives who had become inconvenient to their husbands' desires. Even in homes that appeared peaceful, wives endured endless pressure to maintain emotional purity. Victorian culture idealized the silent, smiling wife who absorbed her husband's frustrations without complaint. Men who drank heavily, gambled, or visited brothels were excused as victims of male passions, while wives were expected to remain loyal and forgiving. If she responded emotionally, she risked being viewed as unstable. If she withdrew, she was cold. If she confronted him, she was unreasonable. The boundaries were impossible. The emotional consequences were devastating. Diaries, letters, and memoirs from Victorian women reveal deep loneliness and silent despair. Many wives described feeling trapped in a life where every decision was made for them, and every dream they once held was slowly suffocated by the weight of societal expectations. Some turned to secret writing. Others confided in female friends, but for many, the only escape they imagined was death. Victorian literature mirrors this reality. Novels like Charlotte Brant's Jane Eyre, Ellen Wood's East Lynne, and Thomas Hardy's Tess of the D'Urbervilles expose the era's hypocrisy, showing heroines crushed by cruel marriages, rigid morality, and unforgiving social codes. These authors, especially women, used fiction to reveal truths that society refused to acknowledge openly. In their stories, the walls of Victorian marriage crack, revealing the dark truth beneath the polished exterior. Despite these horrors, the tide of reform slowly began to rise. The Matrimonial Causes Act of 157 allowed divorce outside of Parliament's direct approval, but the process remained heavily biased. A husband needed only to prove adultery. A wife had to prove adultery plus cruelty or desertion. Many women tried to navigate this system, only to discover that the courtroom replicated the same biases found at home. One powerful example is the case of Annie Besant, a woman trapped in a miserable marriage to a clergyman. When she sought separation due to cruelty, the court not only refused her request, but also punished her attempts to gain independence. She later became a famous writer and social reformer, but only after enduring immense suffering and public judgment. Slowly, voices like Besant's began to change public opinion. Debates erupted in Parliament about women's property rights, child custody, and the right to seek separation. The Married Women's Property Acts of 1870 and 1882 allowed women to keep their own earnings and inherit property independently. This was revolutionary. For the first time in centuries, married women gained some degree of financial identity. Yet even with legal progress, cultural expectations remained almost unchanged. Victorian society continued to celebrate the obedient wife and the authoritative husband. Women who sought independence were labeled radicals. Husbands who treated their wives as equals risked social ridicule. The structure of marriage remained rigid, even as cracks formed in its foundation. Perhaps the most tragic part of Victorian marriage was the way it reshaped women's sense of self. From a young age, girls were taught that their highest purpose was to be a good wife and mother. Education focused on music, sewing, manners, and morality. Girls learned to suppress ambition, ignore personal desires, and prepare for a lifetime of service. By the time they married, many had internalized the idea that suffering was virtuous and silence was strength. And yet, many women quietly resisted. They wrote books, taught classes, joined political movements, and formed circles of support. Some left their marriages despite the consequences. Others lived double lives, dutiful wives in public, writers or activists in private. Their struggles laid the groundwork for the women's rights movements that would transform the 20th century. But during the Victorian era itself, most wives endured their marriages with little hope for autonomy. Their stories were buried beneath the weight of tradition, morality, and the facade of respectability. They lived in beautifully decorated homes that hid emotional wounds. They attended elegant dinners where their voices were suppressed. They raised children while carrying silent grief. The dark side of Victorian marriage was not a rare tragedy. It was a widespread reality. And the worst part was still to come. The moment when marriage, motherhood, and morality collided with deadly consequences for countless women who dared to break, or were forced to break, society's rules. By the late 1880s, the Victorian world stood at a crossroads. The era's polished surface, its lace curtains, well-kept parlors, strict etiquette, and rigid family values, was beginning to crack. Behind that facade lay the accumulated suffering of millions of women whose lives had been shaped, constrained, and often destroyed by marriage laws and cultural expectations. As the century neared its end, the cost of Victorian marriage was becoming impossible to hide. Newspapers, courtrooms, and reform movements began exposing the devastating consequences of a system built on obedience, male authority, and female silence. To understand the final impact of this era, we must look closely at the women whose lives exemplify the dangers of Victorian marriage, and at the broader social consequences that rippled across Britain. One of the clearest examples of the system's cruelty was the fate of Mary Ann Cotton, a working-class woman whose life spiraled into darkness after years of financial instability and violent marriages. Though she later became infamous for her crimes, her early years highlight the limited choices Victorian women faced. Married young, repeatedly pregnant, burdened by poverty, and trapped with alcoholic or abusive husbands, her desperate circumstances reflected the brutal pressures many women endured. When Victorian society later condemned her as a monster, it ignored the environment that shaped her despair. While she ultimately committed horrific acts, her path shows how marriage could trap women in cycles of suffering that offered no safe escape. More common, however, were the countless women who never broke the law but lived and died in quiet misery. Diaries and letters reveal women who lost themselves completely inside their marriages. A middle-class woman named Emily Shaw, whose journal survived the era, described her marriage as a slow erasure, where each year stripped away more of her identity. She wrote of watching her ambitions fade as her husband dismissed her opinions and limited her independence. Emily's words echo those of many Victorian wives, intelligent, educated women who found themselves suffocating under the weight of marital expectations. For upper-class women, the stakes could be even higher. Aristocratic marriages were political alliances, and breaking them was nearly impossible. Women like Lady Caroline Lamb, who became entangled in an infamous affair with Lord Byron, faced intense public scrutiny. Though her story is often romanticized, the aftermath was brutal. She was ostracized, labeled unstable, and pressured into silence while her husband and society enforced rigid moral standards upon her. Victorian marriage often punished women who deviated from expectations, while excusing similar behavior in men. The most heartbreaking victims of this system were the women targeted by the harsh moral codes of the era. If a wife was accused of infidelity, whether true or false, she could lose everything: her home, her children, her reputation, and any claim to financial support. A particularly devastating case was the Hill divorce case, in which a wife was accused of adultery based solely on circumstantial evidence. Even though there was no proof, the court ruled against her, stripping her of her children and property. She ended her life in poverty, while her husband retained his fortune and social standing. This double standard shaped the entire structure of Victorian society. A man's reputation could survive scandal, a woman's could not. These tragedies were not isolated. They reflected a society where moral judgment, legal bias, and gender inequality converged in the most destructive ways. The Victorian marriage system created generations of women who were financially dependent, socially silenced, and legally oppressed. Their suffering was normalized through literature, religion, and law. Despite these hardships, the seeds of change were taking root. Throughout the late 19th century, activists and reformers began challenging the very foundation of Victorian marriage. Many were women who understood the system from personal experience. Their voices became a force that Victorian society could no longer ignore. One of the most influential figures was Josephine Butler **, a passionate advocate for women's rights who exposed the hypocrisy of Britain's sexual double standards. She fought relentlessly against laws that punished women but excused men. Her activism helped reshape national conversations about morality and justice. Another crucial figure was Millicent Fawcett, who pushed not only for women's suffrage, but also for greater educational opportunities and fairer marriage laws. She understood that Victorian marriage trapped women in dependency by denying them the knowledge and skills needed to live independent lives. Her work helped build the foundation for the rights that women would later gain in the early 20th century. Meanwhile, new laws slowly chipped away at the institution's power. The Married Women's Property Act of 1882 finally gave wives full control over their own property and income. This marked the first time a married woman gained legal existence separate from her husband. It was a monumental shift, though it did little to help women already trapped in abusive marriages. The social consequences of Victorian marriage began to ripple into the next generation. Many daughters of the era watched their mothers suffering and vowed not to repeat it. As more women gained education and work opportunities, they became less willing to accept marriages defined by obedience and silence. By the early 1900s, a growing number of women delayed marriage or chose not to marry at all, defying the expectations of their mothers and grandmothers. Victorian marriage also influenced the development of modern feminism. The oppression faced by Victorian wives became evidence of the need for broader social reforms. Activists argued that equality in marriage was impossible without equality in voting, education, and employment. The push for women's rights in the early 20th century was built on the foundation of Victorian women who had endured and resisted the harsh realities of marriage. But perhaps the most lasting consequence of Victorian marriage was the reshaping of society's understanding of partnership. The era forced later generations to confront fundamental questions. What should marriage be? A contract, a partnership, a legal arrangement, a personal choice? Victorian marriage insisted it was a sacred institution that must remain unchanged. But its very rigidity sparked a backlash so powerful that it transformed modern expectations. Today, the idea that a wife is legally or financially dependent on her husband is rejected in most societies. The expectation that women should remain silent or obedient is no longer socially acceptable, and the belief that intimacy is a husband's right rather than a shared experience has also been challenged and overturned. The Victorian era forced the world to confront the dangers of inequality within marriage, and to recognize the importance of autonomy, consent, and mutual respect. Still, the legacy of Victorian marriage lingers. Some modern stereotypes about gender roles, purity, motherhood, and emotional labor can be traced directly back to this period. The polished image of the perfect wife remains deeply rooted in cultural memory, even as modern relationships strive for equality. To understand what Victorian marriage was really like is to understand the emotional and legal battles that shaped the modern world. It is to honor the women who suffered silently and the women who fought loudly for a different future. Their struggles ensured that marriage is no longer a cage, but a choice. Their stories are a reminder that progress is built not only on laws and political victories, but also on the silent endurance of those who lived in the shadows of history.